Greetings everyone, and welcome back to Luca Sprues. In today's video we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We're going to be messing around with the wonderful world of resin 3D printing. So I'm not going to go into an awful lot of depth on the resin printing and the process of designing and all of that. That might be something for a future video. If you've been following me on Patreon, you'll see that I've been experimenting with resin printing for a few months now, and possibly even looking at selling some of my designs. But for this video, we're just going to be focusing on a T-34 interior that I designed and printed in 1/72nd scale, and we're going to be putting it into the Dragon T-34 model 1943. I'm using the anycubic 4K, and I'll talk a little bit about the software and what I used to design the components and all of that, but I won't go into too much depth in this video. That might be something for a future one, as I said. The Dragon kit, we've already had a little look at that in a inbox review. We'll do this interior video, and then in a future video I'll look at actually building the rest of this tank. And I'll also be looking at the italeri T-34, which there's one somewhere here. I'm standing inside of Tectonic Hobbies, where you can buy a lot of model kits, obviously, because it's a hobby store. And if there's any that we don't have in stock that you're after, be sure to come to the front and ask either me or Greg, and we'll happily order some stuff in for you. But for now, we're just going to focus on building the interior. So without further ado, let's get into it. I won't go into too much depth into how I designed all the parts, but basically I used Blender as my 3D designing software and broke the parts up, and then I put them into Lightree to prepare them for printing and add some support frames, which you can see being generated here. They're the kind of orange parts to help all the parts get formed. And basically after 3 or 4 hours the printer came out with all of this. These are for a different tank technically, but the principle is still the same. So the first thing I did after I'd cleaned up the parts and cut them off the frame was to lie them inside the tank without any glue, just to make sure they all fitted, and if they didn't, then I sanded some of the excess on the parts to make sure they would fit nicely, and then I used a little bit of Gorilla Super Glue to glue the parts in place. Here you can see me placing the front driver and the radio coaxial gunner seat in position, which was on a frame. And I built the engine and transmission all as one unit that could be removed. So you can see here I'm gluing the rear of the transmission to the large fan, and once they dried I then put together the parts for the engine. Some of the small accessory parts were glued onto the top of the engine, and it was joined to the bulkhead that separates the engine from the transmission. I included a little air filter which I'd seen on some models and looking through some of the 1942 models technical documents. However, I wouldn't be surprised if in some cases the Soviets didn't bother fitting that air filter because it made the engine extend its lifetime beyond that of the average T-34 on the battlefield. So here you can see I've got the engine, and I joined it up later with a bit of super glue to the transmission unit. And I also did a little bit of test fitting to make sure the fighting compartment bulkhead that separates it from the engine was all good. You'll notice on the bottom of the ammunition boxes they bent upwards a little bit. This was because I didn't quite have enough supports on the resin printer and they distorted. Fortunately though, you can't really see the bottom of them, so I just glued them into place. And here you can see I'm cutting some of the excess away from the bulkhead that separates the fighting and the engine compartments, because it was a little bit too tall to get the upper part of the plastic hull to fit to the lower hull. So after chopping off a little bit of the excess and gluing the last few parts in, I then fitted it and sanded it down just a tiny bit to make sure it would all fit. I had to do something similar with the two radiators either side of the engine by using my side sprue cutters to cut away some of the excess resin to make them a little bit shorter, and then I sanded them down a little bit before gluing them in place. I also had to perform this operation on the bulkhead that separates the engine and the transmission compartments. Once I'd done that, I then glued the bulkhead as well as the transmission to the engine compartments and let them dry. I planned on having them as a separate component that I could put in and out of the tank to help make painting slightly easier. The last part I glued to the engine was the air filters that sit either side of the transmission fan at the back of the engine. I have to say overall, all the engine parts fitted together really well. The only part that was a little bit flimsy was the bulkhead separating the transmission and the engine. It required a little bit of glue to get the part to stay, but in the end it kind of stays in position thanks to the transmission and the engine. I then moved on to adding some of the finer details inside of the hull, such as the 2 cylinders full of compressed air, the spare machine gun ammunition for the tank hull gunner, and also things such as the radios, the lighting, and small electric components that are on the sides of the hull. And the last part I put in place was some of the spare ammunition by the loader's feet, and with that the tank hull had all of its parts put into place, so I could then turn my attention to the turret. The turret required a little bit of removing of excess sprue with the side cutters, and a few extra parts had to be put in place before I could start to add the interior parts for the turret. For my purposes of adding an interior, the Dragon kit is quite excellent. The gun included a basic moulded breech, and some features such as the gunner sight were also included as parts for the insides. So I assembled the entire gun, first by cutting it off the sprue, sanding away some of the excess parts and the seam lines, and gluing it together. The assembly of the gun was all quite easy. You basically just have to put about 4 or 5 pieces together, and the fit of the parts was all pretty good. Once I'd made sure that the barrel and the muzzle brake were nice and level with each other, I then glued the bottom part of the turret to the sidewalls using a little bit of Revell Contactor Professional. Finally, I glued the mantlet for the turret into position, and I was ready to add some of my interior parts. I glued a horizontal and vertical traverse wheel into place, some spare machine gun ammunition for the coaxial gun, and I also used some polystyrene sheets to make a seat for the commander and gunner, since my resin ones had failed to print, which I later fixed in some later versions of the T-34 parts, and also the small linkage that connects the turret to the electric motor for the electric traverse system. And with all the turret parts in place, I let them dry for a bit before moving on to painting them. I'd seen a fair few variations on the painting of the inside of the T-34, but in the end I decided to go with some Tamiya XF2 flat white for the main part of the interior, and for the rear engine compartment XF9 hull red to get more of a primer or almost rusty kind of bare metal look. I pretty much treated the resin like it was any other plastic kit and painted it as I normally would. Basically I did about 4 coats of XF2 flat white on the interior parts, building it up in some nice thin layers, and using a fair bit of water to thin down the paint to help it flow into the areas that were a bit tricky to reach, such as under the seat, and also to keep the paint layers nice and thin so that I wouldn't block any of the detail out by filling it up with too much paint, and to reduce any visible brush strokes. The areas of the interior that I painted white included the fighting compartment, the turret, and also the entire roof of the tank. Since I had the white out, I decided to also paint the bulkhead for the engine and also the air filters flat white. As I mentioned previously, the other colour I used was XF9 Tamiya hull red, which I used for the entire of the engine compartment. Since white is a much lighter colour, you get a lot of darker colours showing through it, so you have to build up a few more layers if you want to get a nice white uniform layer. So I did about 4 coats of white on the interior of the hull and the turret and that, and around about 2 or 3 coats of the XF9 hull red. Since it's a much darker colour, I didn't need to apply as many coats to make it look like it is all uniform. Once I was happy with my white and hull red, I then moved on to the next main base colour, which was a little bit of Tamiya XF16 flat aluminium, to paint a relatively unpolished kind of bare metal look on all of the engine and also on the radiator. This is also quite a light colour, but I did around about 2 or 3 layers of paint, and I was quite happy with the final results. Once the main colours were complete and dry, I then painted the finer details. The first of which was the air filters and piping leading to the engine, which I painted XF18 medium blue based on some reference photos. I painted the exhaust systems initially X31 Titan Gold, and later on I'd do a few tricks to make it look a little bit more rusty and also like the exhaust system was weathered. I painted the bottom of the air filters and also the stowage bins for the ammunition in the bottom of the tank hull with Tamiya XF89 Dark Green 2. This is also the colour I used to paint the exterior of my Soviet World War II tanks. I also forgot to mention that I painted the breech Dark Green 2 inside of the turret as well. XF9 Hull Red made a glorious return with the painting of the cylinder heads, and I also thinned it down using a bit of water so that it would flow and not become solid, and applied it onto the exhaust to create a bit of a rust effect. I painted the seats XF64 Red Brown, which was a somewhat lighter version of Hull Red to create a little bit more of a leatherish kind of worn out look. I also used the same red brown on the exhausts, again applying it with a little bit of water and even wiping some of the excess off with my finger to create some extra rust. I used a very fine brush to paint some XF1 flat black onto the various small equipment inside of the tank, and also on things such as the magazine drums inside of the spare ammunition holders for the machine guns. I also added some steering links for the driver using some copper wire and painted it flat black. Medium blue also made a return with the painting of the cylinders of compressed air, and then I used a very fine brush to dab some XF2 flat white and Vallejo vermilion red onto the various raised details on the small electrical equipment. I also used a bit of vermilion red to paint the first aid kit on the engine bulkhead. I glued in a replacement polystyrene seat for the Commander, and while it was drying, I took the opportunity to patch up any mistakes I'd made using a fine brush and some XF2 flat white. I decided to only use one seat for the Commander/Gunner since a lot of loaders in the T-34 did not have a seat due to rushed production. After I painted the seat red-brown, I then moved on to weathering. I used a fine brush to dab some dried XF16 flat aluminium over basically the entire interior, mainly focusing on the ammunition boxes and the floor of the tank since the crew would obviously be standing on these and scuffing them, and also on the rear bulkhead for the engine and on some of the engine components as well to make them look a little bit weathered. The breech for the gun also received a little bit of chipping, and then I applied some Tamiya Panelline Ascent Black over the entire interior and on the engine components. This not only helps to highlight details making the interior look more impressive and detailed, but it also makes the engine look a little bit oily and weathered, and makes the interior and the fighting compartment especially look really grungy and dirty. And after I was happy with the results, the interior for the Dragon T-34 was completed. So I will confess, I'm not really a mechanic or really an expert in what any of the components of the tank are. I know a little bit here and there, but I'm sure there's a few little inaccuracies here and there, and frankly I would definitely invite some feedback and criticism, because I do want to improve my 3D model and potentially even sell it one day. However, this is kind of more of a prototype at this stage. And I really wanted some interiors for doing interior shots in some of my films, especially the upcoming ones, which will hopefully be finished at some point in the not too distant future, and just to add a little bit of extra detail, especially since the Dragon kit has some very nice photo etched fans and frames on the rear section of the engine deck, and a little bit of detail can be seen if you peer through the slots. So definitely welcome any feedback, and I hope this video was inspiring and gives you a bit of a glimpse into what is possible with resin printing, being able to basically design your own tank interior or extra little component parts from your own house and pretty much have them ready to go within a couple hours or even maybe a day or two at the most. thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. Like I said, there'll probably be some more resin printing projects in the future, so stay tuned for that. And yeah, special shout out, of course, to my wonderful patrons who helped me fund my videos, and of course also the 3D printing. If you're interested in checking out my Patreon page, I'm going to be doing some more exclusive content hopefully in the coming month. Probably a few bloopers and kind of background behind the scenes footage, and I'll also have some stuff on the big animation I'm working on at the moment, which is the bridge part 2. However, I've got a few projects which have kind of sidelined it, so production on that has been a little bit slow, but hopefully I'll be getting back into it in the early part of 2024. So that's it for now, and until the next video, model on!